Welcome to Renewable New Mexico, a program about the people and companies that make our state an epicenter for renewable energy innovation. My name is Sean Wells, and I'm your host. I'd like to welcome back Mark Shalom, a Santa Fe architect specializing in sustainable design and winner of multiple Lifetime Achievement Awards in sustainable design. Mark, thank you for coming back.
Well, glad to be here again.
Well, what brought you to New Mexico originally?
Well, I came in 1974, and I had a real strong urge to learn about solar energy and alternative architecture. And New Mexico was a real hotbed for that. I learned about it through the Whole Earth Catalog, through a wonderful publication on the first Ghost Ranch Solar Conference, and other publications talking about New Mexico and alternative architecture. As an architecture student, the alternatives were very exciting to me and very, very new. And I wanted to explore those directions, so I came to New Mexico.
And what originally sparked your interest in renewable energy?
Well, it made a whole lot of sense to start working with natural systems, natural materials, natural energies. You know, we were frightened because the future was presented to us as nuclear energy. And that, you know, I knew back then was not going to work, not going to happen, and it wasn't good for the planet. So I strongly believe that there are alternatives out there, and we need to develop them and explore them.
And you found a strong support for those fundamental beliefs in New Mexico?
Oh, very much so. It's part of the history of New Mexico. You can go back to the Anasazi and how they utilized passive solar architecture and how they understood the movement of the planets and the moon and the sun and how it affects their architecture, how it affects their agriculture, and how the sun, moon, and the environment became part of their life. And so that's the first lesson. And then when you start looking at vernacular architecture around the world, you find these patterns of utilization of natural local materials and utilizing and harvesting the local climate to your advantage.
So you wanted to fold these philosophies into your architecture. Did you find a support for that? Were you going with the grain or against the grain with those, trying to implement that kind of style in your architecture as a young architect?
It kind of depended on the corner you were sitting on and who you were talking to. If I was with the AIA, they didn't want to hear it, they didn't care about it, they just wanted pretty. But when I sat with people like Peter Van Dresser and Bill Lumpkins and Buck Rogers, the first job I had with the Sun Dwellings team, they were living it, they were doing it, and it was just a natural progression. And Bill Lumpkins, as an architect, would come up with an idea, and then across the table, Buck Rogers, the engineer, would just do calculations in his head and say, okay, it needs to be 12 square feet. And everybody was, wow, how did we do that? And so it was just an incredible experience back then.
Well, can you talk about some of the projects that have lit your passion for renewable energy?
Well, of course.
I'm sure you can, but
well,
I'd like to hear about some of them.
The vernacular architecture around the world, the courtyard, the dynamics of a courtyard, wind cooling towers from Iran, night sky radiant cooling and making of ice in Iran, the passive solar architecture of the Anasazi, and how that was integrated, the Romans, the Greeks. It's all there. And so I got very passionate about that and tried to integrate that into my architecture. William Lumpkins, a very famous New Mexico architect, always integrated passive solar design into his work. And his work was known for its aesthetics and its historical quality of New Mexico craftsmanship. And the passive solar was just part of it and integrated. So it was just a wonderful way to learn, and I was passionate about that. And then later getting passionate about my own work and integrating more than just energy technologies into the buildings, where the building becomes a kinetic machine that responds to its environment and harvests energy, harvests water, cleans water, takes care of its own landscaping, which also has a synergistic effect to the energies of the house. So they're all tied in together, and working all these systems to enhance each other is just a wonderful part of design that nobody talks about or even teaches yet.
And just as important as making it beautiful. As
Oh
you
yeah,
talked about.
very much
Many
so.
of the historical pieces, elements that you talked about around the world are beautiful as standing elements.
Yes.
And they're natural fit to make beautiful architecture. By
And they're
combining
so
them.
true to themselves and their forms and their materials.
Can you talk a little bit about the profile of your clients? Who's taking an interest in sustainable design?
Well, we're seeing many different levels, but mostly it's the working class people that, you know, have to put up that money for that energy bill, have to put up a good part of their paycheck for their home, so they're very concerned about how they spend their money. And in talking to them and explaining what I can do, they get very excited about a new direction in architecture, a home that moves, it changes, it harvests, as well as just saves. And the whole direction now is just, well, we can hide from our climate, and we can protect ourselves from the climate, and we can minimize the energy that we have to put out. But they don't go beyond that into harvesting and opening up to their climate, which is one thing I like to do.
And one thing that you like to do, what are some other things that define your architecture in the realm of sustainable design and renewable energy?
Well, I think I go for the small technologies and simple technologies first.
Like what?
And very simple materials. Well, the passive solar architecture, very simple water collection, use of natural materials such as adobe, local timbers,
Can you
stone.
talk about, I know you're an Adobe guru, can you talk about a little bit about Adobe and for someone who doesn't know what an Adobe is or what an Adobe brick is?
An adobe is very simply a sun-dried earthen brick. And we make them the way they were made 6,000 years ago, with just earth, water, and sun. And that's all you need. You get more complicated if you want to, but that's all you need. You can start making adobes, and if you take care of them, they'll last you 1,000 years. And if you don't, they can return to the earth. And
So
there's
we're
a real
already
beauty to that.
We're already conserving resources in simply making the brick.
Yes.
How does it tie to renewable energy?
Well, it's a battery. It's a thermal battery that we use both in heating and cooling, and has the ability to absorb an enormous amount of energy with very little change in temperature. So we can take the strong amount of energy we get in 8 hours in the wintertime in the Southwest, store it in that adobe with very little change in temperature. In other words, it doesn't get too hot. And then at night when the sun goes down, all of that energy starts coming back out of the walls, keeping you comfortable in the evenings for the 16 hours of darkness in the winter. So it's wonderfully balanced for our climate here in the Southwest. And so it's just a natural material that can be used as a solar battery in passive solar design.
Do you have some of these things, I'm assuming you have some of these systems in place in your own home?
Oh, very much so. Our home is alive with energy and daylight and plants and food and bougainvilleas that are 20 feet tall. And that's how we love to live. And we respond to it. And this time of year, we water the plants, and they become evaporative coolers and filters and help keep the house cool. So it's a wonderful cycle, and it's beautiful to be able to sit in the living room in your pajamas in the middle of winter when it's snow falling and you're looking at beautiful flowers.
You coined the phrase earlier, solar babies. Can you tell me what that means to you?
Solar babies, yes. My son being one, this was probably coined maybe 5 to 10 years ago when people kept saying, well, solar energy, that's in the future. It's not quite here yet. You know, maybe 10 years, maybe 20 years, we'll start looking at solar energy as, you know, feasible for the world. When I'm saying that we have a whole population of young generation that have grown up with solar energy. My son, the Yonda's kids, many children have grown up with passive solar, solar hot water, solar electricity, and nobody's going to tell them, you know, wait 10, 15 years for solar energy to become the norm. They've grown up with it. They've lived with it. A whole generation has grown up with it.
A friend of mine, her daughter insisted on buying a drying rack for clothing. She said, you know, I don't want to use the dryer anymore. We should dry our clothes on here. And for a child, when you explain these philosophies to them, it makes perfect sense. Like, well, why aren't we doing that? And for the parent, it was like, okay, I'll try it. And,
yeah, well, we've been doing this for 40 years. We do have a dryer. And most of the time, my wife will go outside and hang up the clothes. In the middle of the winter, she does have a dryer, and she puts it in the greenhouse. And it does the same thing. It dries there in the greenhouse, puts humidity into the house. And worst case, if it's jeans, she'll do the last 10 minutes in the dryer. But, you know, a lot of people consider that un-American because you have to change your lifestyle to go outside and hang up the clothes. So, you know, clothesline is not a great alternative, but it is.
What's the one thought that you would like to leave people with about renewable energy?
It's simple, it makes sense. It doesn't have to be complicated. It's here now, and we should be utilizing it.
Great. That's a great, perfect last thought. Thank you so much for joining me on the show and bringing your energy.
Well, thank you very much for the opportunity.
My pleasure. Let's take a quick break to hear from our sponsors, and we'll be right back with our next guest. Welcome back to Renewable New Mexico. Today's topic is Building with Sunshine in Mind. Our guest is Lloyd Goding. He's a retired professor of organic chemistry at the University of Wisconsin System. Lloyd, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you.
Well, can you tell me your connection to New Mexico?
I came to New Mexico as a teenager up in the Four Corners area, and during my teenage years I worked with the builders and learned some building skills and so forth. Then I went to the University of New Mexico. I got a PhD in Albuquerque. So I have a lot of experience and time in New Mexico, but then for work I had to leave the state for 30 years, and when retirement time came around, it's like, where are the mountains? Where's the sunshine? I'm going back.
Yeah, I've heard that story before from a couple of locals.
So that's why I'm here again.
Okay. Yeah. Now, what first sparked your original interest in renewable energy? I'm not hearing that in your story.
We bought an old Victorian home in Janesville, Wisconsin, and really it was the energy crisis. It was the paying the fuel bills that it's like, this ain't working. And so at that same time, passive solar was coming around. American Solar Energy Society had a magazine called Solar Age. There were books coming out, and the passive solar, being familiar with the New Mexico sunshine, sounded like the right thing to do. So we went out and bought a south-facing hill and made plans to build a passive solar house.
And that's what brought you here today. That's why we've invited you, is that you have that first-hand experience with working with passive solar design in homes that you have lived in. Can you tell me more about those projects, and I guess especially the one that you're working on here in New Mexico, but the background of the Wisconsin house, how it got you to New Mexico?
Well, I'll start in Wisconsin. We got interested in passive solar. We wanted, like I said, to make something that was affordable, something that we could do ourselves, something that would be passive solar. Early on then, in the planning and design stage, we came upon the idea of earth sheltering, that is earth covering part of the house. And in Wisconsin, where you have wind and terrible winters, really, we thought that would be very important. So that home we lived in for 20 years. It worked beautifully. even though, you know, we made some mistakes early on. Then we came here in 2004 with a clear idea in mind of what we wanted to build in New Mexico. Again, a south-facing hill set at 7,000 feet of elevation, so we have some cold to continue with there. Again, we're very comfortable.
Yeah, I'm curious to know what motivated you to originally, I'm a very practical person, so if someone says, oh, it saves you a dime to put solar panels on your house, I'll look at it. But what motivated you to look at passive solar homes as an option for yourselves?
Mostly the potential to harvest the sun as a source of energy, to heat your home.
It just felt right, in a sense, like it felt...
Well, you know, again, being familiar with how intense the sunshine is in New Mexico, you know, in Wisconsin, nobody pays attention to the sun. We don't see it enough. But we knew it would work. I mean, the principles sounded right. And so even though there were few examples at the time, the principles sounded right.
And you had the experience from Wisconsin, as you mentioned, the learning curve in Wisconsin to bring that to, you had a sense that you were capable of doing it. When someone says, oh, I think I'll build my own passive solar home, you didn't have any hesitation, it sounds like.
You know, I worked with builders when I was a teenager. And a lot of what I learned kind of on the job, but I was able to move away from that and beyond that. I'm a chemist, I'm an experimenter. And so I wasn't afraid of experimentation, and I wasn't afraid of doing things differently from the way I'd been taught. And that made it possible to say, I think building a house underground will work. You know, everybody's telling you it's going to be full of spiders, everybody's telling you you shouldn't do this, but it seemed right.
Yeah.
And clearly the sun was there, and we knew right where it would be, and so we just moved ahead.
So can you go into a little more detail about what kind of, it sounds like you were designing specifically for New Mexico. You thought about the elevation, you thought about the sun, the angle of the sun. What other kinds of things did you implement into the house, into the design of the house to take advantage of that?
Mass, a tremendous amount of mass. I mean,
can you detail that for us?
Well,
what does that mean?
The home in Wisconsin was all poured concrete with a concrete floor, actually had a concrete roof because we were underground. Our house here in New Mexico, again, has concrete, large amount of massive structure. The walls are made out of poured in place pumice, plastered on the inside. The floors are all poured concrete. So that gives you a lot of mass that you don't get in frame construction.
And what does that mean for the person that's living there?
What it means is
mass?
The mass modifies the temperature. What we found out early on in our 1980 house was that the temperature did not swing, you know, and planning for cold days wasn't so important. Planning for cold periods, yes, but cold days, there really aren't any cold days. There's times when the sun doesn't shine, there's times when the temperature's cold, but the temperature drops very, very slowly, and again comes back up very slowly. So you have
so
this.
You get that regulation of temperature.
Yes, and that's one of the things that contributes to comfort.
Yeah.
Is the fact that the temperature doesn't take these wild swings.
Right, especially in a desert state like ours, where you've got those cold nights and the high temperatures
High
in the
temperature
afternoon.
during the day,
yeah.
yes, and very cold at night. I mean, and so the temperature stays steady. And an evening when it's cool, you walk in the house and it's warm. That very same day, you walk outside in the middle of the day and come back in the house and it's cool.
Sure.
So the same day, the house can be cool and it can be warm.
And you showed me some shots from the Wisconsin house. I saw that you had some glazing that faced the sun, so you could have a greenhouse. Did you incorporate some of your window treatments and overhangs and things like that?
Yes, of course, we calculated our overhangs and our shading so that we wouldn't overheat in the summertime. Then we incorporated low-cost glazing. We used patio door replacement glass that's affordable. So we were trying to make an affordable house too, and with both of these dwellings.
So why do you think that New Mexico has been such a rich resource for solar and renewable energy?
It goes back to the Anasazi, I think, the sun availability, obviously, But I think the hippie movement, if I can call it that, kind of, you know, those people were willing to experiment with things and to try out ideas. And then you had the scientists on the other side. So New Mexico is really kind of a nice mixing place for that.
That's a great way to look at it. Yeah, I never thought of it in those terms, the dichotomy, the future lookers and the history.
And the kind of, we can do this ourselves, and no, we need a little science to guide us here. Works out well.
Yeah. What would you like someone to know about what you've learned about renewable energy and solar energy?
Passive solar houses can easily be affordable. No difference in cost between conventional construction. You just have to plan well. But probably the most significant thing that we learned from 25 or 30 years of living in such a home is how comfortable it is. These homes are comfortable. Because the temperature stays so steady, they're quiet, it's just, they're good homes.
So you don't have to sacrifice anything just
Quite
to
the
live
opposite, you
passive.
gain things. You gain things.
Yeah, I think that's a new perception that you're presenting.
It certainly is.
Yeah. And if you were working with young people, what would you try to teach them and leave them with?
Well, I think that today's building, you know, in 1980 we didn't know what we were doing, you know, really. I mean, we were learning our way through it. There weren't a lot of rules. In 2004, we tried to do the best we could do, and yet today you can do even better because we know so much more. And so if you're going forward with a building project, do your homework ahead of time, invest heavily in the future energy burden of that house because it's going to pay off huge dividends over the lifetime of that house. That house is going to be here for 75 or 100 years. It's not like getting an energy efficient car. It's like getting something that's going to be yours and someone else's, and it's going to be comfortable and affordable for a long, long time.
Okay, I've got some questions that we're asking the guests, so I need to give you some options to these enchanting New Mexico questions.
Okay.
Okay, your first choice is sunshine, wind, or biomass?
All of them, but for me, sunshine.
Sunshine,
Yeah.
Especially in this state. It
Yeah.
just makes sense, as
And
opposed to
the
Wisconsin.
passive solar is my passion.
Okay, active or passive?
Passive.
You-
Although both. We have active solar in our home. We have both domestic hot
Passive
water.
seems easy.
It is easy,
we
and
can
it's
do it
just part
just
of the
with a little bit of
structure
forethought.
with no additional cost.
Right. Okay, and then you've been New Mexican all your life, essentially.
A good bit.
So can you tell me red or green?
Both again.
Your
but
Christmas.
I really
Your
no,
Christmas.
no, not Christmas. Green or red, but I prefer green.
Oh,
I
okay,
like
I
green.
see. You wouldn't mix.
I
You
don't
don't
mix.
mix. Okay, great. Well, thank you so much. I learned a lot, and I would love to implement some of these ideas in my own home construction someday, so I will be doing more research.
Thanks so much.
Thank you. Thank you for bringing your energy to the show. That's our program. Thank you for watching, and be sure to watch us next week for another episode of Renewable New Mexico. Until next time, this is Sean Wells reminding you we are all solar powered.